Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about measuring an economy's performance or simply answering the general question that we might often hear people discuss: how's the economy? So we're looking for things we could look at going forward. We're looking at things we could look at to answer that question. We're going to start with something called GDP, which I'm sure everyone has heard of. GDP stands for what? Gross Domestic Product. Gross, just so you know, in accounting and economics, finance, everywhere, gross is what's brought in. Or in terms of like a single firm, gross is revenue. It's what's brought in. Net is after something, costs of some kind. But the difference between gross and net whenever you're talking about some kind of a measure. So that helps us to get to the definition. The definition of GDP, it's the words here to get everything captured that we need to. The specific words really matter. Okay. Broadly speaking, it's the country's aggregate output. It's what the economy makes. The formal definition, and each word really does matter on this one, is the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a given year within a country's borders. The total market value of all final goods and services produced within a given year within a country's borders. That also means, since it's within a country's borders, that means it includes goods and services produced by foreign supplied resources. So there are a couple terms in there that matter. The total market value, if we're talking about GDP, that's general. We're generalizing nominal GDP. That's in market prices, so that's why it's market value for this definition for GDP. So it's today's prices, market value of all final goods and services. Well, if you're looking in the book, you see there's a distinction between final goods and intermediate goods. Final goods are the things that we as households, we go out and we buy these things. Intermediate goods are the parts that go into the production of something else. So as I look around, I'm not seeing a great example. Yeah, here we go. Earlier in the semester, we had a thing about screens. I think cell phone screens was one of our things. Well, the cell phone screen was an intermediate good that went into the cell phone. The cell phone is the final product. So that's what final goods and services is about. Within a given year, well, we have to have some time period that we're analyzing. And within a country's borders matters, because if we extend beyond the country's borders, then we're talking about GNP, or gross national product. That's the distinction between GDP and gross national product. GDP is within the borders. Gross national product includes what other, if we're talking about the U.S. gross national product, what other what Americans make who are living in other countries is included in our GNP, but not our GDP. So that's why that distinction is important. That's why every word in that definition matters to tell us what this thing, GDP, really is. So now I'm going to go down a path that is only touched on somewhere in the book, and it's a good path for us to explore in relation to this chapter, as well as the unemployment and inflation chapter, as well as to understand for life in general. We can, when we're measuring things, we're looking at variables. That's what variables do. They're measurements, and they vary because measurements can vary with time or space or events and things like that. So we can categorize our measurements into one of two buckets. We could categorize measurements as stock variables versus flow variables. This is a fun little distinction to be aware of. You've probably not thought of this before. Most people haven't till we really dig into it. A stock variable is a count at a given time. How many gallons of water is in a tub? How many gallons of water or cubic yards of water is in a pond? How many cars are in a parking lot? How many cars are on the Route 50 bridge? What is the size of the economy? How many people are unemployed? What's another one? What is the money supply? What is the CPI, or what is the GDP deflator at a given time? We could categorize these as stock as well, at least in this context, because those numbers by themselves seldom have very useful meanings for us. They might be good to know, and they might have some usefulness, but most of the time they don't help us to understand what's going on, because they're a measurement at a specific time. It's a count of something at a specific time. What helps us understand what's going on is flow variables. Flow variables are rates of change from one stock variable at a given time to another stock variable. Knowing how things are changing helps us to forecast and predict where things are going, which is what we usually, in most contexts, most things we're discussing, that's kind of what we want to be able to do, is have some idea of what's going on, what's happening. A stock variable being just a count, like I threw out there, the number of cars on the Route 50 bridge. Who cares how many cars are on the Route 50 bridge right now? Tell me how many cars are going across the bridge per hour, and let me look at that at different times of day, and that tells me when it's busy. Flow, cars per hour, a rate is a useful measurement. 6.5 million people applied for unemployment insurance last week. That doesn't, big numbers mean very little to me. The size of the U.S. economy, I looked this up this morning. Size of the U.S. economy is, as of 2020, before coronavirus, was $21.4 trillion. That doesn't mean a whole lot more to me than hearing some number, 6.5 million people applied for unemployment insurance last week. What I need to have context and useful numbers isn't big numbers, because most of the time people forget that a trillion, they think of a trillion as the thing just bigger than a billion. A trillion is 1,000 billions, which is 1,000 millions. But we think of them as, I think most people think of them as step 1, step 2, and step 3. The difference between them is very vast. But we hear these big numbers so frequently that it's just white noise. It has very little meaning to hear something as a big number. Oh my gosh, we spent $2 trillion on the war in Iraq. That's a huge number. We just spent $2 trillion last week on the first of the stimulus acts related to the coronavirus. Those big numbers, I bet nobody thought about that. The entire war in Iraq cost what we spent just in the first of the 4 stimulus bills so far on coronavirus. We hear these big numbers and we just go, oh, that sounds like a big number. And we don't often think about what those mean. So I'm just using that as my example of why I think people are just so inundated with big numbers that they don't have a lot of context. But what does tend to have to stick more when we hear it in our minds and to have more meaning is a flow variable, or something about a rate. So when I said 6.5 million people filed for unemployment insurance last week, that was based on the week before, 3.5 million people applied then. So the sum is way up, but the rate of unemployment insurance filings is going up. The forecast rate is 32% unemployment rate is what we're looking to have, by the best guess right now, as a benchmark guess, is what we're looking to have due to coronavirus. 32% unemployment rate, which is all the people willing and able to work but without a job over all the people willing and able to work who have a job or don't have a job. That is the labor force, if we want to look back at the last chapter. So the rate has more impact for us. And what's more is when rates are changing over time, that has still more impact. If we say the unemployment rate is doubling every week, which is probably about right for the next few weeks, that's what we're expecting, what we're looking at as the data comes in, that has, oh wow, that really means something. It means a lot more to me to say that the rate of people filing is doubling a week 100% rate, 100% flow variable, than to say 6.5 million or 13 million, whatever. Those numbers just go right over our heads. Everybody goes, oh, okay, for the most part, and it has no bearing. So flow variables mean more to us. The rate of growth of the U.S. economy over the long run has historically been about 2%, we're saying now. That's kind of the benchmark rule, 2% rate of growth. Well, that tells me that the size of the economy then is doubling about every 35 years. And I know that because somewhere in the text there is a thing called the rule of 70, or we can use the rule of 72. The difference is about compounding. So generally what you want to do is, because all you're doing is something estimate like I just did, you generally want to use whichever rule is more easily divisible by the rate or the years you're given. What I'm saying is the number, let's say 70, divided by can be broken into factors, right? Any number that's not prime can be broken into factors. Well, the factors of 70 will tell you the time period and rate that it takes an asset or liability roughly. Roughly is how we use this. It's just a benchmark to double. Or you could use 72. So if you're told something is an 8% rate, I would use 72, because 9 times that would. So if something is growing at an 8% rate of growth annually on average, that tells me it's going to take about 9 years to double, because 9 times 8 is 72, or 72 divided by 8 is 9. If somebody told me that something was growing at a rate of 7%, well, that's lower, so that's shouldn't be surprising. I would probably just say, okay, 7 goes into 70 10 times, so that's going to double in about 10 years. Usually the rule of 72 or the rule of 70, that's what we're using it for, is just spitballing anyway, because we're talking about average long-term rates of growth and forecasts, which are not usually correct, because if we had firm information, we would do an actual calculation to see the doubling time period, but this is something that we can just use off the cuff or from memory, like I'm doing with the numbers I'm making up as I go. So that's in the textbook, the rule of 72, as I believe the one Miller uses. Different books use the 70 or the 72. That's how it works. And if the rate of growth of the U.S. economy is 2%, then I know it's doubling roughly every 35 years. Let's see. When we're measuring our economy, we're interested to just bigger picture still. The whole ball of wax is what it's doing. We're interested in our standard of living. Now, if I say that the economy is doubling every 35 years in the U.S., that's a flow approach, and that's somewhat useful, right? But you know what else is useful is how many people are sharing that output. If the economy is doubling every 35 years, but the population is growing at a faster rate, GDP per person would actually be falling. And this is supposed to be a measure of our standard of living. So that highlights a couple of things. The very best measure of economic well-being is real GDP per capita. Real GDP means that we have done something to take away the effects of inflation. Because if we're going back to our definition, when we're talking about market value, if we have high inflation, the market value is rising just because of inflation, because market value is in today's prices. That doesn't tell us anything about the standard of living if it's inflationary. So we have to control for inflation to get to something more meaningful. Real GDP controls for inflation. It gets back to some base year, so we are keeping a consistent measure of some base year value of goods and services. Okay? So real GDP is a better measure of standard of living, particularly the rate of growth of real GDP. The flow variable is a better measure of the standard of living than is nominal GDP, or what is more broadly, people just say GDP. But what's more important still is GDP per capita, because we could have the population changing at the same time as we have the growth in real GDP. And how those two are changing relative to each other tells us very roughly how the typical person within that economy might be doing, very roughly. So hopefully this example will bring home what I'm at least trying to say. The largest economy in the world, and we use GDP to compare the size of economies across the globe. The largest economy in the world is the United States. I mentioned in 2020, before coronavirus, which is going to have an impact, the estimated GDP of the economy was about $21.4 trillion. The next largest economy in the world is China. I looked up, according to the NASDAQ, China's GDP is 14.14 trillion. So you have a pretty good gap there. About a third. We're about a third larger, according to these numbers from NASDAQ. Well, what else do we know about China? What's, when you learned about China in elementary school, what's one of the first things that they told you? China has over 1 billion people. We have an estimated, in the United States, 331 million is the population. Sorry, I just did it. I multiplied something by 1,000 times, just like that, with a change of a letter. We have 331 million in our country as an estimated population. China has 1.4 billion. So they are over, or roughly 3 times our population. 3 times our population would put us right about 1 billion, so they're over 3 times our population. I guess it'd be about 4 times our population. But their GDP is about a third less than ours. So what does that mean about GDP per person? I don't have what that divides out to be for China. It wasn't in my source, but we could divide 1.4 billion by 330. We could divide 14.14 trillion by 1.4 billion, and we would have China's GDP per capita. That wasn't already done in my source that I looked at this morning. But what was already done in my source that I looked at this morning, and hopefully it checks out the same numbers I just gave because it was from the same source, is that GDP per capita in the U.S. is currently at about $65,111. So that means that if the output of our economy were divided equally across all 331 million Americans, we would be making per year in goods and services, in terms of goods and services, each of us would be making $65,111, which is not that far from the median income, which last I looked was in the mid-50s or something like that. That's been a few years ago, so I could be off on that. It's a little higher, and that makes sense because we do have people that are very high earners of income and people that are very low earners of income. And so being right on median, having the median income be exactly equal to GDP per capita would probably be quite something, but it's actually pretty close. That gets me to something else I mentioned. I said with GDP looking at GDP, there were a couple of challenges, and that's one of them. As a standard of living, GDP doesn't speak to how the income or the output of the economy, which is the same thing, which is what I'm going to end with this chapter with the circular flow model. GDP doesn't tell us, whichever measure, real GDP, nominal GDP, or GDP, real GDP per capita, none of those actually give us information about how that income of the economy is distributed among people throughout the economy. GDP per capita would be if everyone was sharing the output at the same portion. Of course, that's not likely to be so, but that's a shortcoming of GDP. Just broadly speaking, GDP as a standard of living is that it doesn't tell us the distribution of that income within an economy. But you know what? That's something we can look at. We can look at what GDP is, as we've done, and then say, oh, well, that's a shortcoming of it. What do we think about that? And we can focus on that if we want to. So that's a common criticism of using GDP as a standard of living. And there are others. I just want to make sure this is a good place to discuss them. I think this is. Another thing that is not picked up in GDP per capita, even real GDP per capita as a measure, is something like, well, what if producing a lot of goods and services is very harmful to the environment? Well, if we're talking about something that's a standard of living, we could damage the environment and have a high standard of living by this measure, and that would be misleading. So some people point to that as a weakness of using GDP as a measure of standard of living. But it kind of would just kind of, I wouldn't say shrug that off, but I can't think of a better term, and say, yeah, well, you can factor that into your thinking. Here's our baseline. Real GDP per capita is our best measure of the standard of living. And you could say, yeah, but, and adjust from that anchor all you want. Nobody's saying it's not possible or not even maybe true in some countries' cases, but you can just use what we're saying and adjust from that based on the environmental things. I do go through this later in the semester, some pros and cons about economic growth, so I'm going to hold off on that. And I think that wraps up the length of this segment of the video that I wanted to do. So I'll see you on the next part, which is the national income identity.